If you were the son in this story, who would you call your real parent? The person on your birth certificate? Or the person who stayed when nobody was watching? Because on the morning Charles Whitmore's will was read aloud, a room full of well-dressed relatives arrived, expecting a clean transfer of power, but they left with their pride in pieces and their voices stuck in their throats. The solicitor's office was the kind of place that made people speak softer without being asked, with polished wood that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old money. Rain tapped at the tall windows in thin, impatient lines, and umbrellas leaned in a dripping row by the door like silent witnesses. Everyone sat as if posture could protect them from surprise. They wore the careful expressions people practice for funerals, faces arranged in solemn sympathy, while their minds ran numbers. At the far end of the table, a young man sat alone. Oliver Whitmore was 24, and even in a plain black suit, he looked like someone who had spent his life being observed. His hands rested on the table, fingers interlaced, steady in a way that did not match his age. The steady ones were always the people who learned early that emotions could be used against them. He did not speak much. He did not look at anyone for too long. He kept his eyes on the notepad in front of him, as if a blank page was safer than a room full of expectations. To Oliver's left sat Lucinda Hale, his late mother's sister, dressed in cream and black like she could not decide whether she was grieving or performing authority. Lucinda smiled at the solicitor, as though she owned the air in the room. Her son, Matthew, sat behind her with a watch that flashed each time he adjusted his cuff. A second cousin Oliver barely knew whispered to another relative about responsibilities and legacy, as if those words were keys. And then there was Esther Adeyemi. She arrived quietly, because quiet had become her habit in the Whitmore world. She did not wear pearls. She did not wear perfume. She wore a simple navy dress, modest shoes, and a small gold cross at her throat that had nothing to do with display and everything to do with survival. Her hands rested in her lap with the calm of someone used to being underestimated. She was not seated at the center, but she was not hidden either. She sat where she had been told to sit, and she did not apologize with her eyes for taking up space. Lucinda noticed her immediately. Lucinda's mouth tightened in a way that did not match her smile. Her eyes flicked from Esther's face to Oliver's, then away again, like a person checking whether a lock has been tampered with. She leaned toward the cousin beside her and whispered something that made the cousin's eyebrows lift. Oliver did not react. Oliver did not even glance at Esther. He kept his gaze forward, as if he had practiced not turning his head when the room tried to pull him apart. The solicitor entered with a folder and a polite expression that had the careful neutrality of a professional who had seen families become strangers over paper. He introduced himself, confirmed identities, and began with the formalities that everyone pretended to listen to. Then he opened the will. At first, it sounded exactly as Lucinda expected. There were charitable donations, several sentimental bequests, the usual language about gratitude and memory. Lucinda nodded along, lips pressed into a satisfied line, as if each clause confirmed the world's natural order. Then the solicitor cleared his throat and read a name that did not belong to any branch of the Whitmore family tree. Esther Adeyemi, he said, evenly. The room shifted, not dramatically at first, but in a series of small movements that carried a shared message. Why is she here, and why is she being addressed? Lucinda's smile sharpened into something colder. Matthew's head lifted. The cousins stopped whispering. Esther did not move. She kept her face composed, but inside her chest a familiar tightness returned, the tightness she always felt when a door she did not control was about to open. The solicitor read on. I leave the property known as Whitmore House, including its contents, with the exception of items specifically bequeathed elsewhere, to Esther Adeyemi. A chair scraped the floor. Someone inhaled sharply. Lucinda's hand went to her chest, not from grief, but from outrage, trying to pretend it was shock. "That's not possible," Lucinda said, too quickly. The solicitor continued as if he had not heard her, because the paper did not care about Lucinda's tone. "I leave my private accounts held at," he paused, to reference the document precisely, "to Esther Adeyemi, to be managed for the benefit of my son, Oliver James Whitmore, at her discretion, with professional advice where appropriate." Lucinda's composure cracked. Her voice rose half an octave. "Discretion," she repeated, as if it were a swear word. "You cannot give discretion to staff." The solicitor lifted his eyes. "Miss Hale," he said, with practiced calm, "I will ask you to let me finish." Lucinda's face flushed, and she sat back as if restraining herself was a personal insult. The solicitor turned a page. "And," he read, "I appoint Esther Adeyemi as the primary executor of this will, and I request that she serve as the final decision-maker regarding all personal affairs relating to my son, including, but not limited to, guardianship decisions, property access, and any trust structures referenced herein." That was the moment the room stopped pretending. Matthew laughed once, short and disbelieving. "Guardianship," he said. "He's an adult." Lucinda leaned forward so fast, her chair legs squealed. "This is manipulation," she said, now fully angry. "This is not my brother-in-law speaking. Someone has filled his head. Someone has used." Her gaze snapped to Esther. "Used her position." Esther's fingers tightened in her lap, but her posture did not change. She had spent 2 decades in that house learning the difference between reacting and surviving. She looked at Lucinda without defiance and without fear, which was worse for Lucinda than any shouting would have been. Oliver finally raised his head. He looked at Lucinda with a calmness that made her falter, because she had expected him to be confused and grateful and obedient. Instead, Oliver spoke in a voice that was not loud but was solid. "Stop," Oliver said. Lucinda blinked. "Oliver, darling, you don't understand what's happening." "I understand," Oliver replied. He turned his gaze to the solicitor. "Keep reading." The solicitor nodded and continued, but everyone in the room now heard the words differently. These were not just assets and titles. These were choices, deliberate and sharp. When the solicitor reached the letter attached to the will, Lucinda's chin lifted as though she could force the ink to change by disapproving of it hard enough. The solicitor opened the letter and read, "My family will be surprised," Charles Whitmore had written, in clean, controlled handwriting. "They will say I was not myself. They will say I was influenced. They will say I made a mistake." Lucinda's lips parted, already preparing a rebuttal to a dead man. The solicitor continued. "Esther Adeyemi raised my son," the letter said. "Not as a job, as a life. When I was absent, she was present. When grief made our home cold, she made it human. If you are angry, be angry at me. Do not punish the person who carried what I failed to carry." Someone swallowed audibly. Lucinda looked around, seeking allies, but the room had shifted again. Even the cousin who had been whispering about legacy sat still, uncertain now whether he wanted to be seen on the wrong side of this. The solicitor finished the letter with a final sentence that landed like a gavel. "Oliver may have my name," Charles had written, "but Esther has my trust." Silence held the room for a full breath, then another. Lucinda's voice came out thin and sharp. "This is disgraceful," she said. "He was vulnerable. She took advantage." Esther's gaze finally moved to Oliver, and for the first time since she walked into the room, her expression softened. It was a softness that did not ask permission from anyone. Oliver looked back at her, and in his face there was no surprise. There was only a quiet, painful confirmation, as if a truth he had always lived with had finally been spoken aloud in a place that could not pretend it wasn't real. Lucinda turned to Oliver, urgent now. "You can contest this," she said. "You should contest this. This is your family." Oliver's mouth tightened. Then he said the sentence that ended the performance. "She is my family," Oliver replied. Lucinda stared at him, stunned, as if he had betrayed a script she had written years ago. Matthew's fingers curled into the edge of his chair. The cousin looked away, suddenly embarrassed by his earlier certainty. Esther finally spoke. Her voice was calm, and it did not tremble. "I did not ask for this," Esther said, looking at the solicitor first, then at Lucinda, then at the room. "I did not demand this. I did not threaten anyone. I worked, and I stayed, and I did what needed doing, because there was a child in that house who deserved kindness." She paused, then added, with quiet precision, "If you want to fight the will, that is your right, but do not lie about the boy's life, because I lived it with him." Lucinda's eyes narrowed. "You're very confident for staff." Esther's expression did not change. "I am confident because I am telling the truth," she said. Oliver pushed his chair back and stood, not dramatically, but with intention. He looked at Lucinda as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. "If you contest it," Oliver said, "you will have to tell the court why you visited Whitmore House once a month and never stayed long enough to learn what my favorite food was. You will have to explain why you called her the help while she was the one helping me breathe." Lucinda's face went rigid. Oliver's gaze moved to Matthew. "And you," he said, "will have to explain why you only started calling me cousin when Dad got sick." Matthew opened his mouth, but no words arrived. Oliver picked up his coat, then turned to Esther. "Can we go?" he asked. Esther stood, hands still composed, and nodded once. "Yes," she said. "We can go." They walked out together into the rain, not as employer and housemaid, not as heir and staff, but as two people leaving a room that had finally been forced to admit what it had refused to name for years. And as the office door closed behind them, Lucinda leaned toward the solicitor and spoke with a cold steadiness that promised war. "This is not over," she said. Outside, Esther and Oliver paused under the awning. The rain was light now, but it carried the weight of memory. Oliver stared at the wet pavement, then spoke without looking at her. "You don't have to do this," he said, voice rough. "You don't have to fight them." Esther turned her face toward him. "I am not fighting them," she replied. "I am standing where I have always stood, beside you." Oliver's throat moved as he swallowed something sharp, and that was the beginning of the real story, because the will reading was only the spark. The fire came next. If you walked into a house where grief lived in every hallway, would you do your job quietly and leave? Or would you risk becoming the person a child might actually trust? Esther's first year at Whitmore House began with rules that were not written down, but were enforced all the same. The agency coordinator who dropped her off smiled too brightly and spoke too quickly, as if speed could hide discomfort. The coordinator told Esther about schedules, security codes, and keeping things professional, then left without stepping fully into the home, like even the doorway carried a warning. Charles Whitmore did not do introductions the way warm people did. He did not show Esther family photos or point out where the good cups were kept. He walked her through the home with the brisk pace of a man showing a property, not a father showing a life. He paused at the kitchen, pointed to the pantry, named the housekeeper who came twice a week, and then said the sentence that explained everything without meaning to. "Oliver doesn't do well with change," Charles said, voice flat. Esther nodded, because she had heard that phrase before, and she knew it could mean anything from normal childhood nerves to a kind of wound that never quite closed. When they reached Oliver's room, Charles hesitated with his hand on the door. His hesitation was brief, but Esther noticed it, because she had learned that men who were confident about their role did not pause outside their child's space, as if entering might expose failure. Inside, Oliver sat on the floor with a toy dinosaur in his lap. His clothes were clean and expensive, but his posture was guarded, shoulders slightly raised, chin tucked like he expected something to fall. He watched Esther with eyes that did not blink enough. Children who are safe tend to look away at least once, because they assume the world will still be there when they look back. Oliver watched as if he had learned that things could disappear if he stopped paying attention. Charles introduced Esther the way someone introduces an appliance. "This is Esther," he said. "She will be here to help." Oliver did not speak. Esther did not approach too fast. She did not lean over him. She simply lowered herself a little, keeping distance, and said, "Hello, Oliver. It is nice to meet you." Her voice carried softness, but not pity, because children could smell pity the way they could smell fear. Oliver's fingers tightened around the dinosaur. Charles looked at his watch. "I have calls," he said, and left the room as if he were escaping. The door clicked shut. Esther stayed still for a moment, letting Oliver hear that she was not rushing, not demanding. Then she said, calmly, "I will be in the kitchen if you need water." She did not ask whether he needed water, because a frightened child often answered questions with whatever felt safest, which was usually no. In the kitchen, Esther found a house that ran on polished surfaces and careful quiet. Everything had a place, but nothing felt lived in. A bowl of fruit sat on the counter like decoration, not nourishment. A framed family photo rested near the hallway, but it was turned slightly away from the flow of the home, as if the picture itself made the air heavy. Esther turned it back without thinking. The photo showed Charles and his wife, Vivian, standing behind a younger Oliver. Vivian's smile was bright, but her eyes looked tired in a way Esther recognized. The tiredness in Vivian's eyes was not about sleep. It was about carrying other people. Esther set the frame down gently and felt a small sting of empathy she did not quite welcome, because empathy in a job like this could become dangerous. By the end of the first week, Esther learned the rhythms. Charles left early and returned late. His phone never stopped. He ate dinners that arrived cold because meetings ran long. He spoke to Oliver kindly in the way people spoke to strangers they wished well but did not know. He asked, "How was school?" Then half listened to the answer. He offered toys and trips, as if money could stand in for presents. Oliver, in response, became smaller. He did not act out. He did not scream. He did not throw things. He simply disappeared into silence, and adults often mistook silence for good behavior. Esther did not. One morning, while Esther prepared breakfast, she heard soft footsteps. Oliver hovered in the doorway in socks, hair slightly messy, eyes scanning the room before settling on Esther as if she were an object that might move without warning. Esther kept her movements steady. "Good morning," she said. "There is toast and there is porridge. You may choose." Oliver stared at the bowl, then at Esther's face, then at the door, as though expecting someone to correct her. "You can choose," Esther repeated, gently, and continued stirring, giving him space to decide without pressure. After a long pause, Oliver whispered, "Toast." Esther nodded once. "Toast," she agreed, as if the choice were perfectly normal. When Oliver sat, he did not sit comfortably. He perched on the chair's edge, ready to flee. Esther placed the plate in front of him and then did something no one had instructed her to do. She sat at the table too, not directly opposite him like an interrogation, but slightly angled, so he could look at her without feeling trapped. Oliver watched her sit as if this was the first time an adult had chosen to be near him without a reason that benefited themselves. He took one bite, then another. Halfway through, he dropped the toast. It landed butter side down. Oliver froze so completely it looked like his body had shut down. Esther reached for a cloth. "It is only toast," she said, voice calm. Oliver's eyes glistened. "Please don't tell my dad," he whispered. Esther paused, because it was not the toast that mattered. It was the fact that a child believed mistakes deserved consequences severe enough to fear. Esther knelt beside him again. Careful. "Oliver," she said softly, "your father should not punish you for an accident. If he does, that is not your fault." Oliver's lower lip trembled, but he did not cry. He swallowed his tears like he had practiced. That evening, when Charles came home, Esther waited for the right moment, because timing was a kind of safety. She spoke while Charles was still standing, coat on, keys in hand, before he could disappear into his office. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "Oliver is frightened of making mistakes." Charles's expression tightened. "He's sensitive," he replied quickly, as if labeling it would make it manageable. Esther met his eyes. "Sensitive children become careful adults," she said. "Sometimes too careful." Charles looked away, jaw clenched, as if a truth had been placed in front of him and he did not know where to put it. "You're here to keep things running," Charles said, controlled, "not to analyze my son." Esther could have retreated then. She could have nodded and become invisible. She understood in that moment how many people had chosen that route in this house, how the home had learned to keep pain quiet by refusing to name it. But she thought of Oliver's whisper, and she chose risk. "I am here to keep the household safe," Esther replied, voice respectful but firm. "Safety includes him." Charles stared at her. His eyes were sharp, but beneath the sharpness was a tiredness that was almost pleading, like he wanted someone to take responsibility and resented them for being able to. "Vivian handled all of that," he said finally, and his voice broke on her name in a way he tried to hide. "She was good at the emotional part." Esther's chest tightened. "And when she died," Esther said carefully, "you had to carry both roles, and you have been carrying neither." The silence that followed felt dangerous. Charles's face went pale, then flushed. He took a step closer, not threatening, but intense. "You do not know what happened to my wife," he said. Esther held steady. "I know grief," she replied, "and I know loneliness." Charles's eyes flickered, and for a second he looked less like a wealthy businessman and more like a man standing on a cracked foundation, trying not to fall through. "She died in a car accident," Charles said quietly. "It was raining. She was picking Oliver up from a birthday party. I was supposed to go, but I stayed at work because I thought the meeting mattered." He exhaled. Harsh. "The meeting still happened. She still died." Esther felt the words settle into the room like dust after a collapse. Oliver's silence suddenly made sense in a more painful way, because children did not simply grieve, they blamed themselves, and they blamed the adults around them for surviving. "I'm sorry," Esther said, and she meant it. Charles's expression hardened again, a mask snapping back into place. "Don't be," he said. "Just do your job." That was how Charles protected himself. If he reduced Esther to staff, he did not have to acknowledge how much he needed what she was quietly providing. It might have stayed that way, an uneasy truce, if Lucinda Hale had not returned. Lucinda arrived one Sunday with expensive sunglasses pushed into her hair, and the confidence of someone who believed blood made them entitled. She hugged Oliver briefly, stiffly, then turned to Esther with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You must be the new housemaid," Lucinda said, loud enough for Charles to hear. Esther kept her tone level. "I'm Esther. I help manage the household." Lucinda's eyebrows lifted as if Esther had used the wrong title for herself. "How ambitious," she said lightly, then turned away, already dismissing her. That afternoon, Lucinda cornered Charles in his study. Esther did not mean to overhear, but the house carried sound in certain corridors, and Lucinda did not seem concerned about privacy. "She's getting close to him," Lucinda said, voice sharp. "Oliver, it isn't appropriate." "She's helping," Charles replied, weary. Lucinda's laugh was small and mean. "Helping," she repeated. "Charles, you know what people like that do. They attach themselves. They become indispensable. Then they ask for things." Esther's stomach tightened at the phrase, "people like that." It was not only prejudice, it was strategy. Lucinda wanted Esther to feel like an outsider in the only place she had begun to matter. Charles sighed. "Esther has been professional." Lucinda lowered her voice. "So was the last one, until she started stealing," she said. And Esther realized with a cold clarity that Lucinda was planting seeds, because seeds did not need proof to grow, only repetition. That week, small traps began appearing. A watch Charles wore daily went missing, then turned up in a laundry basket Esther had never touched. A drawer in Oliver's room was found open, and Lucinda remarked casually that staff sometimes went through private things. A neighbor mentioned seeing a woman from the house speaking to a man at the gate, and Lucinda asked, too sweetly, whether Esther had invited anyone over. Esther understood what was happening, but understanding did not stop fear. In wealthy homes, perception could become truth faster than facts. The worst part came when Oliver began repeating Lucinda's words without understanding the poison inside them. One evening, Oliver stood in the kitchen doorway while Esther prepared dinner and asked, in a small voice, "Auntie Lucy said you might leave one day." Esther's hands stilled. "Why would she say that?" Esther asked gently. Oliver shrugged, eyes down. "She said, people like you always leave when you get what you want." Esther felt her chest tighten, not from insult, but from grief, because Oliver was learning mistrust again, and mistrust was a language this house taught fluently. She set the knife down and crouched so her face met his. "Oliver," she said softly, "I cannot promise the future, because adults should not promise what life can break. But I can promise this. I will not leave you suddenly. If I ever have to go, I will tell you. I will not disappear." End quote. Oliver's eyes filled. "Promise," he whispered, as if a promise could replace a mother. Esther hesitated, then said, "I promise I will not disappear." Behind them, in the hallway, a floorboard creaked. Esther turned her head and saw Lucinda standing there, holding a phone loosely at her side. Screen dark, expression unreadable. Lucinda smiled. "I thought I heard a little bonding session," she said brightly. "Charles really should know what promises are being made to his son." Esther's stomach dropped because she understood the game now. Lucinda was not merely suspicious. Lucinda was building a case. And Esther realized she had entered the most dangerous part of caring for someone, the part where love could be used as evidence against you. Lucinda did not confront Esther in a loud scene the way villains did in films. She did something far more effective in real life. She turned doubt into a habit, then let other people carry it for her. The morning after Lucinda overheard Esther's promise, Charles came down late, tie half done, phone already pressed to his ear. He walked into the kitchen mid-conversation, nodded at Esther without looking, and reached for coffee as if the day were ordinary. Esther watched him carefully, because the calmness felt staged, like a room that had been cleaned too quickly. When Charles ended the call, he finally looked at Esther. His eyes lingered on her face a fraction too long, and Esther felt the shift immediately. Something had been said to him. Something had been planted. "Lucinda told me you promised Oliver you wouldn't leave," Charles said, voice controlled. Esther kept her hands steady as she wiped the counter. "He asked," she replied. He was frightened. Charles's jaw tightened, the old guilt rising behind his annoyance. "You can't make promises to my son," he said. "You're not his parent." Esther's chest tightened at the word parent because it was a word that belonged to grief in this house. "I did not claim to be," she said. "I was trying to keep him calm." Charles looked away, then back again. "You're crossing boundaries," he said, and the phrase sounded rehearsed, like someone had given him the exact wording that made him feel justified. Esther nodded once. "Then tell me your boundaries," she said evenly. "Tell me what comforts him, and I will follow it." Charles's mouth opened, then closed. He did not have an answer, because that was the truth Lucinda did not have to say out loud. Charles could not set emotional boundaries for Oliver, because Charles had not been emotionally present long enough to understand what Oliver needed. Instead of admitting that, Charles took the safer route. He took the route that protected his pride. "Just do your job," he said, and walked out of the room. Oliver appeared a moment later, hovering near the doorway like a small shadow. He watched Esther's face with a cautious intensity, as if he could sense trouble the way animals sense storms. "Are you in trouble?" he whispered. Esther turned and softened her voice. "No," she said, because children remembered adults' tone more than adults' truth. "Eat your breakfast." Oliver did not touch the food immediately. "Auntie Lucy doesn't like you," he said. Esther's fingers paused on the edge of the plate. "Auntie Lucy doesn't know me," she replied gently. Oliver frowned. "She said you're trying to take Dad's money." Esther felt a cold stillness settle in her stomach. She had expected Lucinda to aim at her character, but she had not expected Lucinda to use Oliver as a messenger. Esther kept her face calm anyway, because showing anger would frighten him, and fear was what Lucinda wanted to spread. "I am paid for my work," Esther said. "I do not take things that do not belong to me." Oliver stared at her as if memorizing her words in case he needed them later. Then he asked, in a voice so small it barely reached her, "Are you leaving?" Esther's throat tightened. She could not promise forever. She could promise truth. "Not today," she said softly. "Today, I am here." Oliver nodded like that was all he could afford to hope for. Lucinda's next move arrived on a Tuesday, disguised as politeness. She invited Charles to lunch at a restaurant near his office and insisted it was to check in, as if she were a caring aunt rather than a strategist. Charles told Esther he would be late home, then left without asking about Oliver's day. That evening, Lucinda appeared at Whitmore House without calling first. Matthew came with her, carrying the casual arrogance of a man who believed every room was his by default. They walked in like they were arriving to inspect a property. Lucinda's gaze swept the hallway, the sitting room, the stairs, then landed on Esther. "Esther," she said brightly, "could I have a quick word with you?" Esther kept her tone polite. "Of course." Lucinda led her to the side sitting room, closing the door just enough to make the conversation feel private, but not enough to be accused of secrecy later. The detail struck Esther immediately. Lucinda always left herself an escape route. "I'm going to be direct," Lucinda said, smile still in place. Charles is vulnerable right now. He's under pressure. He's lonely. Esther remained silent, waiting. Lucinda tilted her head. And Oliver is impressionable, she added. You've become very central in his life. Esther met her eyes. He is a child who lost his mother, she said. Children need stability. Lucinda's smile faltered for a half-second, then returned sharper. Stability is one thing, she said. Replacement is another. I am not replacing anyone, Esther replied, calm. Lucinda leaned forward slightly. Then you won't mind when we put a few safeguards in place, she said. Just to protect everyone. Esther's stomach tightened. What safeguards? She asked. Lucinda's tone stayed light, almost friendly. A quick audit of the household accounts, she said. A review of access to the safe. It's normal in families like ours. Esther understood the trap immediately. If she refused, Lucinda would call her defensive. If she agreed, Lucinda could manufacture suspicion by framing the process itself as evidence of wrongdoing. I have nothing to hide, Esther said carefully. If Mr. Whitmore requests it, I will cooperate. Lucinda's eyes gleamed. Wonderful, she said, as if Esther had volunteered for something she did not understand. I'll speak to Charles. The audit began the following week, conducted by an accountant Charles used for business matters. The accountant was professional and neutral, but the presence of scrutiny changed the air in the house. Oliver grew quieter. Charles grew tense. Esther moved through her tasks as if the floor had become fragile, careful not to make any motion that could be interpreted as guilt. Then the missing cash was discovered. It was not a fortune, not the kind of amount that would justify the drama Lucinda seemed eager to create. It was several £100s from a petty cash envelope in Charles's desk, money used for household errands and last-minute purchases. The accountant noted the discrepancy, and Charles's eyes turned toward Esther before he even spoke. Esther felt the moment land like a stone. I did not take it, she said immediately. Charles's mouth tightened. The only people with access are me, he said, then paused, as if the next part tasted bitter. And you. Esther held his gaze. Check the cameras, she said. Charles blinked, as if he had forgotten the house had cameras. Lucinda, seated nearby with her hands folded elegantly, spoke before Charles could respond. Oh, Charles, Lucinda sighed, don't be naive. If someone is doing something improper, they won't do it where they can be recorded. Esther turned to Lucinda. Are you accusing me? Esther asked calmly, even though her hands felt cold. Lucinda offered a look of wounded innocence. I'm saying we should be careful, she replied, because Oliver is involved, and this is a delicate household. Oliver stood in the hallway, half hidden behind the doorframe, watching with wide eyes. Esther noticed him and felt her heart drop, because this was not a conversation a child should witness. Lucinda noticed him too, and Esther saw, with a sick certainty, that Lucinda did not care. Charles rubbed his forehead, face tightening as if he were trying to squeeze a headache away. Enough, he said. He turned to Esther. I need you to give me your keys. Esther's breath caught. For how long? She asked. I don't know, Charles replied, and that was the cruelest part, because it meant he had already placed her in the category of risk. Esther looked at Oliver again. The child's face had gone pale. He took a small step forward. No, Oliver whispered. Charles didn't look at him. Oliver, go upstairs, he said, voice sharp. Oliver didn't move. She didn't do it, he said, louder this time. Charles's expression hardened because Oliver's defiance made him feel exposed. You don't know, Charles snapped. You're a child. Oliver flinched, as if the words had struck him physically. Esther felt her own anger rise, but she kept it contained because Oliver needed steadiness, not heat. Esther unclipped the keys from her belt and placed them on the table. The sound of metal on wood felt final. Lucinda watched, satisfied, as if the entire scene were proof of her skill. "Esther will take a few days off," Charles said, voice strained. "Until we sort this out." "A few days," Oliver repeated, as if testing whether those words meant disappearance. He turned to Esther, eyes wet, and the child's fear ripped through her composure, because it was the same fear he had voiced before. "Are you leaving?" Esther stepped toward him, careful not to touch without permission. "Oliver," she said softly, "listen to me. I am not disappearing." Lucinda interrupted with a sweet, cutting tone. "That's not your decision, dear." Esther turned her head toward Lucinda. "Do not speak to him like he is an object," Esther said, quietly. Lucinda's smile thinned. "And do not speak to me like you belong here," she replied. Charles exhaled sharply, as if the air in the room had become smoke. "Esther," he said, "please go pack what you need. I'll have the driver take you to your flat." Esther's chest tightened. She lived in a small staff accommodation unit on the edge of the property, a space that had felt, until now, like a fragile form of safety. Being sent away felt like being erased again. She nodded once, because she would not beg in front of Oliver. "All right," she said. Oliver's face crumpled. "Please," he whispered, and then, as if he could not stop himself, he grabbed Esther's hand. Esther squeezed his fingers gently. "I will come back," she said, and the statement was not a guarantee of Charles's permission, but a promise of her intention. "You will see me again." Oliver nodded violently, tears spilling now, and Esther felt her own eyes sting because she knew what Lucinda had done. Lucinda had not simply targeted Esther's job. Lucinda had targeted Oliver's ability to trust. That night, Esther packed quietly. She did not take anything that wasn't hers, not even a pen from the kitchen drawer, because she understood how easily suspicion could be fed. She left behind the small things Oliver had drawn for her, not because she didn't want them, but because she was afraid they would be used against him. When the driver took her to her flat, rain began again, light but persistent, tapping the pavement like a reminder. Esther sat on her bed and stared at her hands, hands that had cooked and cleaned and soothed and held a child through nightmares. She had done everything right, and still the world had found a way to punish her for being close enough to matter. Her phone rang just after midnight. It was the house. Esther answered immediately. "Oliver," she said, because she knew before anyone spoke. A panicked staff member's voice rushed through the line. "He's gone," the woman said. "We can't find him. His bed is empty. Mr. Whitmore is shouting, and Miss Hale is saying we should call the police. And Esther, he left a note." Esther's heart stopped for a beat. "What does it say?" she asked. Voice steady, only because she forced it. The staff member swallowed audibly. "It says, 'If Esther disappears, I will disappear too.'" Esther closed her eyes, the room tilting around her, and she realized Lucinda had finally succeeded in one thing. She had pushed a grieving child toward the edge of panic. Esther did not cry when she heard the note. She did not have time. Fear does not always arrive as panic. Sometimes it arrives as focus, so sharp it feels calm. "Tell Mr. Whitmore I'm coming," she said into the phone. "Do not let anyone speak to the press. Do not post anything online. Keep the gates open. Check the security feed again. Slowly." The staff member sounded close to tears. "Miss Hale says we should call the police immediately." "Call them," Esther replied. "But listen to me carefully. Oliver is not a criminal. He is a child who is terrified. If strangers in uniforms surround the house, he will run farther." The line went quiet for a beat. Then the woman whispered, "Okay." Esther grabbed her coat and her keys and left her flat before the kettle could even boil. The night air smelled wet and metallic, rain misting under the streetlights. She got into her small car and drove toward Whitmore House, with her headlights cutting through thin fog. Every second felt like a decision she would regret later if she made it wrong. Because there was a difference between searching and chasing. Searching kept a child safe. Chasing made a child disappear. At the main gates, the guard tried to stop her. Mr. Whitmore said, "Move," Esther said, not shouting, but using a voice that carried certainty. "His son is missing." The guard's face changed immediately, and the barrier lifted. Inside the house, everything was noise. Charles was in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, voice raised in a way Esther had never heard before. Lucinda stood nearby, with her arms folded, face composed as if she were watching a situation she had predicted, which made Esther's stomach turn. Oliver's school bag sat on the floor by the stairs. That detail hit Esther like a punch, because it meant Oliver had planned, not merely fled. Children who ran in panic did not pack bags. Children who believed they were about to be abandoned did. Charles saw Esther and strode toward her, anger and relief colliding into one expression. "You!" he snapped, as if she were both the cause and the solution. "Why would you tell him you'd never leave? Why would you?" Esther cut through his words with a steadiness that felt like steel. "Where does Oliver go when he is frightened?" she asked. Charles opened his mouth, then hesitated, because he didn't know. The truth shamed him so deeply that his face hardened again to protect itself. Lucinda stepped in, voice smooth. "He's probably hiding on the grounds. He's dramatic, Charles, like Vivian. He wants attention." Esther turned her head toward Lucinda, and for the first time there was no politeness in her eyes. "He is not dramatic," Esther said quietly. "He is grieving, and he is scared." Lucinda's smile twitched. "Well, if he's scared, he shouldn't have been taught to cling to staff," she replied. Charles flinched as if he wanted to shout at Lucinda and could not admit it. He was trapped in his own need to appear in control. Esther faced Charles again. "Did you check Vivian's garden?" she asked. Charles blinked. "The rose garden," he said, almost confused by the specificity. "Yes," Esther replied. "Did you check the bench behind the hedge, the one she used to sit on? Oliver goes there sometimes." Charles stared at her. "How do you know that?" "Because he told me," Esther said. "Because I listen." Charles's throat moved, guilt surfacing again. But Esther did not let him drown in it yet. "Who saw him last?" she asked, already moving. A staff member spoke quickly. "About an hour ago. He went upstairs." Then we realized Esther wasn't here, and then you accused her and sent her away, Esther thought. But she did not say it, because this was not the moment for blame. This was the moment for locating a child. Esther walked briskly to the back door and stepped into the rain, then stopped under the porch light and took a breath. She forced herself to slow down. A child could sense frantic energy. If Oliver heard chaos, he would believe he had caused it and run farther. Esther needed her voice to be soft when she found him. "Do you want security with you?" Charles called from behind her. Esther turned. "No," she said. "Not yet. Too many people will scare him." Lucinda scoffed. "You're not in charge here." Esther didn't look at her. She looked at Charles. "Do you want your son back?" Esther asked. Charles's jaw clenched. Then he nodded once, sharp and helpless. "Yes." "Then let me do this," Esther said, and left before Lucinda could insert herself again. She crossed the wet lawn, shoes darkening with water, raindrops cooling her face. The hedges rose on either side of the path like dark walls. Esther kept her eyes scanning for movement, but she didn't call Oliver's name yet. Calling too soon could make him hide deeper. She listened instead for the sound of breath, or sobbing, or the small rustle of a child shifting weight. At Vivian's rose garden, the flowers were gone for the season, leaving bare stems that looked like fragile bones. The bench behind the hedge was visible in the weak light, and Esther's heart tightened when she saw it was empty. She moved toward the small greenhouse at the edge of the garden. It was old, slightly cracked, the kind of thing a wealthy man kept because his wife had loved it, not because he ever used it. Esther reached the door and saw a smear of fog on the inside of the glass, as if someone's breath had warmed it. Esther didn't rush. She knelt slightly, putting herself at child height even though Oliver couldn't see her yet, and spoke gently through the glass. "Oliver," she said softly, "it's Esther. I'm here." Silence. Then a faint movement, a shadow shifting behind a pot. "Oliver," Esther repeated, still quiet. "You are not in trouble. I am not angry. I just need to know you're safe." The greenhouse latch clicked from the inside, hesitant. The door opened a few inches. Oliver's face appeared, pale and wet. His eyes were red, his cheeks streaked with tears that had mixed with rain. His school bag strap sat crooked on his shoulder like he'd put it on too fast. "You came," he whispered, and the words were not relief so much as disbelief. Esther's throat tightened. She kept her voice steady. "Yes," she said, "I came." Oliver's lower lip trembled. "They said you were leaving," he said. "Auntie Lucy said you were going away because you did something bad." Esther held his gaze. "I didn't do something bad," she replied, "and I did not leave you. I was told to go to my flat." "That's different." Oliver's brows furrowed, trying to understand adult cruelty in child logic. "But Dad thinks you stole," he whispered. Esther's chest hurt at the word stole, because it meant Lucinda's poison had reached Oliver fully. She chose truth without detail, because children did not need every adult mess. "Someone is trying to make you afraid," Esther said softly. "I won't let that happen." Oliver's eyes flicked past her, toward the dark lawn. "Are there police?" he whispered. Esther shook her head. "Not here," she said. "It's only me. If you come with me, I will keep you close." Oliver hesitated, and Esther could see the fear fighting the need. The child who had already lost one parent had learned to mistrust the stability of anything good. "I don't want you to disappear," he said, voice breaking. Esther felt tears rise, but she kept them contained because Oliver needed her to be strong in a gentle way, not a dramatic way. "I will not disappear," she said, choosing words she could live with. "And if adults make decisions about my job, I will still tell you the truth. I will still say goodbye properly if I ever have to go. Do you understand?" Oliver swallowed hard, then nodded. Esther held out her hand. Oliver stepped out and grabbed it with both of his hands, as if one wasn't enough. His fingers were freezing. "You're so cold," Esther murmured. "I didn't want to be inside without you," Oliver whispered, and Esther felt the sentence lodge in her chest like a stone. They walked back slowly, Esther keeping her body between Oliver and the open darkness, her grip firm but not tight. When the house came into view, lights blazing, shadows moving behind curtains, Oliver's breathing quickened. "Don't let them shout," Oliver pleaded. Esther leaned down slightly as they reached the porch. "Look at me," she said. Oliver looked up. "If anyone shouts, you stay with me. You don't answer. You let me speak." Oliver nodded again, eyes wet. Inside, the hallway was crowded. Charles turned at the sound of the door and rushed forward, relief crashing through him so suddenly it almost looked like rage. "Oliver," he breathed, reaching out. Oliver flinched instinctively, and Charles froze mid-step like he had been struck. The flinch said more than words ever could. It said Oliver wasn't sure his father's arms were a safe place. Esther stepped forward, calm. "He's safe," she said. Lucinda appeared over Charles's shoulder, face tight. "How convenient," she said coldly. "You find him, alone." In the garden, Oliver squeezed Esther's hand harder. Charles's eyes flicked between Lucinda and Esther saw the war inside him. Pride against love, control against reality, business instincts against father instincts. Esther made the decision for him. She turned to Charles and spoke plainly. "Oliver ran because he thought I would disappear," she said. "Because he has already lost his mother, and he cannot survive another disappearance. You sent me away without explaining anything to him. You let Lucinda speak into his fear." Lucinda snapped, "How dare you!" Charles lifted a hand, silencing her. It was the first time he had ever silenced Lucinda in front of staff. "Enough!" Charles said, voice shaking with something he couldn't hide now. He looked down at Oliver. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words sounded unfamiliar in his mouth. "I'm sorry I scared you." Oliver stared at him, uncertain. Charles swallowed hard, then turned to the staff member who had called Esther. "Call off the police," he said. "Tell them he's home." Lucinda's eyes widened. "Charles, you can't just—" "I can," Charles said, and his voice was low now, dangerous in its calm. "And I will." Lucinda stared at him, shocked, then shifted her gaze to Esther with a look that promised retaliation. Charles stepped closer to Esther, keeping his voice low so Oliver wouldn't hear the full weight. "If you didn't take the money," he said, "then who did?" Esther held his gaze. "You already know," she replied quietly. "You just don't want to admit it." "Why?" Charles's face tightened. His eyes flicked to Lucinda, then away again, like looking directly at the truth would burn. Oliver whispered, "Can Esther stay?" The room went still. Charles looked at his son, then at Esther, and in that moment, Esther understood something that would shape the rest of their lives. Charles loved Oliver, but Charles feared the cost of changing more than he feared the damage of staying the same. That fear was what Lucinda relied on. Charles inhaled slowly, then said the words that surprised even him. "Yes," he said, "Esther will stay." Lucinda's mouth fell open. Charles cut her off without looking at her. "She will stay," he repeated, "and we will find out who set this up. Tonight." Esther felt Oliver's grip loosen slightly, like the child's body had finally allowed a fraction of relief. But Esther did not relax, because she knew Lucinda would not accept defeat quietly. And now, with Oliver found and the house calm again, the real battle was about to begin. Not the battle for money, but the battle for truth. The morning after Oliver was found, Whitmore House felt like a stage the day after a disastrous performance. The curtains were open, the props still in place, but everyone moved more carefully, as if the walls themselves now remembered what had been said. Charles called an all-staff meeting in the sitting room. He did it awkwardly, like a man unused to addressing anyone who wasn't in the boardroom. People gathered with nervous faces. The part-time cleaner, the gardener, the security guard, the cook who came 3 days a week. Esther stood near the doorway, hands folded in front of her, ready to step forward if Oliver appeared. Lucinda arrived late, which was deliberate. She walked in with Matthew at her side and took a chair like it was a throne. Her expression said she expected to watch a dismissal, not a discussion. Charles cleared his throat. "Cash went missing from my desk," he said. "We know that. I reacted before I had all the facts." His jaw flexed. "That will not happen again." The staff shifted, surprised. Apologies from men like Charles did not flow easily. Lucinda gave a tight smile. "We can't ignore theft," she said sweetly. "It sends the wrong message." Charles didn't look at her. "No one said it was theft yet." He answered, tone cooler. "We said it was missing." He turned to the accountant, who sat at a side table with a laptop open and a thick file. "We've gone through the numbers again," Charles said. "We've checked petty cash withdrawals for the last 6 months." The accountant spoke up. "There's a pattern," he said. "Small amounts missing every few weeks, but only when there's been a larger transfer out of one of the personal accounts. Someone was skimming when they thought no one would notice." Lucinda laughed once. "That proves nothing," she said. "Staff could easily—" "Staff," the accountant interrupted politely, "don't have online access to those accounts." The room went still. Charles finally looked at Lucinda. "You're the only person besides me who has had that access," he said. "My business accounts are separate. This is household." Lucinda's smile faltered for the first time. Color rose in her cheeks. "Are you accusing me?" she demanded. "After everything I've done for this family." Charles didn't answer. He glanced at the security guard. "You pulled the camera footage for the last 2 weeks," he said. "Anything we should see?" The guard nodded, nervous. "Yes, sir. The night before the audit, someone went into your study while you were out. They used your code. They took the envelope, counted it, and then put some of it back in a different drawer." Lucinda rolled her eyes. "I walk into my brother-in-law's study all the time," she said. "That doesn't mean anything." The guard swallowed. "I didn't say it was you, Miss Hale," he answered, "but I have the clip ready." Charles nodded toward the television on the wall. The accountant connected his laptop, and a grainy black and white video filled the screen. The timestamp and corridor angle were clear. A figure entered the study. The shot wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Matthew shifted in his seat. "It's probably Esther," Lucinda said quickly, "or that cleaner." Then the figure turned enough that the profile came into view. It was Matthew. The room reacted in small, sharp sounds. A gasp, a whispered, "Oh," the scrape of a chair. Matthew went pale. "I was just checking something," Matthew said. "Dad asked me to." "You don't live here," Charles cut in, voice like ice. "You don't have errands in my study." Lucinda's face drained of color. "There must be a mistake," she said. "Too fast." "Show another angle." The guard shook his head. "There's more," he said, reluctant. He advanced the footage. It showed Matthew opening the desk, taking out the envelope, counting notes, then slipping a few into his pocket before replacing the rest in a side drawer. The clip stopped. Lucinda stood abruptly. "Turn that off," she snapped. "This is humiliating." Charles looked at Matthew, and something in his expression broke not just anger, but disappointment deep enough to hurt. "You tried to frame her," Charles said, nodding toward Esther without taking his eyes off Matthew. "You knew the audit was coming. You knew Lucinda had already been whispering about her. You thought if the numbers didn't add up, I'd fire the one person Oliver trusts." Matthew's bravado crumpled. "It's not like that," he muttered. "It's just money. You don't even notice." "That's the point," Charles replied, voice low. "You counted on me not noticing. You counted on me looking at the easiest target instead." Lucinda stepped between them, hands raised. "He's a child," she said, desperate. "He made a mistake." Esther almost laughed at the word child. Matthew was nearly 30. Charles turned his head slowly. "Oliver is a child," he said. "Matthew is a grown man. His gaze hardened. And you encouraged this. Lucinda's mouth opened. I would never. You have spent months undermining Esther, Charles said, telling me she's dangerous, telling Oliver people like her always leave. You created the story that made this believable. Lucinda's composure cracked. I was protecting you, she insisted. You're vulnerable, Charles. You cling to anyone who makes you feel less guilty about Vivian. The name landed like a slap. Everyone fell silent. Charles inhaled sharply. If you cared about Vivian, he said, you would care about her son. Instead, you tried to tear down the only person actually raising him. Lucinda's eyes glittered with unshed tears. After everything I've done, she said, voice shaking, I was here when she died. I arranged the funeral. I kept this family's name from being dragged through the papers. And then you tried to drag my staff through the mud instead, Charles replied. For a moment, no one moved. Then a small voice spoke from the doorway. I'm not staff, Oliver said. Everyone turned. Oliver stood there, not hiding this time. His shoulders were back. His hands were at his sides. He looked at Lucinda, then at Matthew, then at his father. I'm her family, Oliver said, nodding toward Esther. You told me family doesn't steal from each other. Lucinda drew herself up. Oliver, you don't understand the adult world, she began. Sometimes, I understand who was there, Oliver interrupted. And the interruption itself was shocking, because he had always been the one who shrank. You came once a month. You brought presents. You talked about money. Then you left. Lucinda's cheeks flushed. How dare you speak to me like that, she said. Oliver looked at his father. Do I have to stay in a room with people who tried to get her sent away? He asked. Charles's face changed. The question cut straight through his own denial. He realized, in that moment, that his silence had made Lucinda feel powerful enough to do whatever she wanted under his roof. No, Charles said, firm. You don't. He turned to Lucinda. You and Matthew need to go. Lucinda stared at him, eyes wide. You're choosing her over your own blood, she said, voice a mixture of disbelief and fury. Charles exhaled. I'm choosing my son, he answered. And I'm choosing the person who has actually put him first. He looked at the accountant. I'll deal with the legal side, he said. I want every petty cash discrepancy documented. If there are charges to be brought, they'll be brought properly. No more whisper campaigns. Lucinda grabbed her bag with shaking hands. This isn't the end of it, she said. When people hear you've let the help run your house, they'll talk. Let them, Charles replied. Matthew muttered something under his breath and followed her out, avoiding Esther's eyes as if her calm presence burned. When the door finally closed, the house felt different. It wasn't lighter, not yet, but a weight had shifted. A truth had been dragged into daylight and forced to stand still. Charles turned to the staff. Anyone who thought Esther was stealing, he said, owes her an apology, out loud. The cleaner stepped forward first. I'm sorry, she said, eyes on the floor. I shouldn't have assumed. The gardener nodded, embarrassed. Me too, he added. You've always been fair to us. Even the security guard shook his head. I should have spoken up sooner, he murmured. I've seen who actually cares about the boy. Esther accepted each apology with a small nod, not collecting them like trophies, but letting them land. She hadn't asked for vindication, but she took it for Oliver's sake. He needed to see that adults could admit they were wrong. When the others had dispersed, Charles looked at Esther. For once, there was no boss in his posture, only a man standing in the wreckage of his own avoidance. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for sending you away, for not trusting you, for letting her talk about you like that in front of my son. Esther held his gaze. "You're not apologizing to staff," she said. "You're apologizing to the person who kept your child from disappearing." Charles swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yes," he agreed, "to the person who kept my child from disappearing." Oliver stepped closer to Esther, not hiding behind her, but standing beside her. "Are you staying?" he asked. Esther looked between father and son, and the question wasn't really about jobs or pay. It was about whether she believed this house could become a place where she wasn't always one accusation away from exile. "I will stay," she said slowly, "as long as the truth stays too. I will not live in a house that pretends." Charles nodded again, as if he understood that this was not a favor she was doing for him, but a boundary she was drawing for herself. From that day, Lucinda came by less often. When she did, her tone was brittle and polite around Esther, and Oliver never ran to greet her at the door again. The distance had been named. It couldn't be undone, but the damage was not entirely healed. Oliver had learned, in one brutal week, that adults could turn love into leverage. And that lesson would stay with him into adulthood, shaping how he read every room, including the room where a lawyer would one day say Esther's name in a will everyone assumed belonged to blood relatives only. There is a kind of tiredness that doesn't show in the face right away. It shows in the way a man starts sitting down more often to put on his shoes. On the way he rubs his chest absent-mindedly after climbing the stairs. In the way a calendar fills with quiet doctor appointments that no one talks about at dinner. For Charles Whitmore, that tiredness crept in almost a decade after the night Oliver ran away to the greenhouse. Life, at least on the surface, continued in the smooth, expensive way wealthy lives often do. The business grew. New contracts were signed. A second office opened in London. Articles were written in glossy magazines about the Whitmore legacy. Inside the house, the real legacy was quieter. Oliver grew taller almost before anyone noticed. His voice deepened. His hair refused to lie flat at the back, no matter what he did. He started wearing headphones, then stopped when he realized they let him hide too easily. He still spent most of his free time in the kitchen or the back garden, orbiting Esther the way planets orbit a sun they trust. He never fully lost the habit of checking whether she was in the room before he relaxed. At 15, he came home one afternoon with his jumper inside out and an essay marked with a red A and 3 exclamation marks. He placed the paper on the counter without comment. Esther turned from the stove, wiped her hands, and read the first lines. It was about grief. About a boy who couldn't say his mother's name without tasting metal. "This is good," she said quietly. Oliver shrugged, trying not to smile. "What does your father think?" she asked. Oliver hesitated. "I haven't shown him," he said. "He's busy." Busy had become the family's polite word for absent. Esther passed the paper back. "Keep this," she said. "One day you might need to remember that you can explain yourself better than other people explain you." At 16, Oliver started coming home later, not because he was running wild, but because he had discovered libraries stayed open longer than school. He'd sit between shelves with books about law, psychology, business, anything that promised an instruction manual for human behavior. Adult conversation had taught him that power often belonged to the people who knew the rules better than anyone else. One evening, he found Esther in the small staff office, going through receipts. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her add columns with the same care she'd once used to cut his food into smaller pieces when he was small and distracted. "Do you think Dad trusts me?" he asked. Esther looked up. The question was simple. The weight behind it wasn't. "I think he loves you," she said. "That's not what I asked," Oliver replied, a little sharper than he meant to. Esther held his gaze. "He is learning to trust." she said. Some of us were taught that trust is a luxury, not a necessity. It takes time to unlearn that. Oliver frowned. What about you? He asked. Do you trust him? Esther thought about the night he had demanded her keys, about the way he'd looked at her when money went missing, about the way he'd watched Lucinda whisper in corners instead of shutting the conversations down. I trust him to try, she said. And sometimes that is all a person can give. Oliver absorbed that, then nodded slowly. If I had a son, he said, I'd want him to trust me, without having to earn it back. Esther smiled, a small, sad curve. Then you will have to live differently, she said. Children watch what we do more than what we say. In those years, Charles existed in the background of their daily life, like a distant planet, important, massive, but orbiting too far out to warm anyone. He was not cruel. He bought Oliver what he asked for. He paid for therapy sessions, tutors, trips. He nodded when teachers said Oliver was bright but reserved. He signed forms. What he didn't do was sit on the edge of his son's bed and ask how nightmares felt. He didn't show up at school plays, even when Oliver only had 3 lines. He attended parent meetings via email. Then, slowly, his body started keeping score. He downplayed it at first. Just heartburn, he said. Just getting older, just stress. But doctors didn't use the word just. They used words like hypertension and cardiac risk and lifestyle change. Esther noticed the pills on the kitchen counter. She noticed how quickly he got winded walking from driveway to front door. She noticed Oliver noticing it too, with a fear he tried to hide behind teenage sarcasm. One evening, after a hospital appointment that ran late, Charles came home looking smaller somehow. His tie was loosened. His shirt was wrinkled. He sat heavily at the kitchen table instead of going straight to his office, which alone was enough to make Esther put the kettle on without being asked. Oliver hovered near the sink, pretending to dry a plate that had already been dry for 5 minutes. What did they say? Oliver asked, voice too casual. Charles stared at his hands. They said I need to take this seriously, he replied. Oliver swallowed. Are you sick? Charles's jaw tightened. I'm not dying, he said quickly. Not today. The today hung in the air like steam. Esther set 3 mugs down and sat opposite them, uninvited but not unwelcome. What does taking it seriously look like? She asked. Charles didn't meet her eyes. Paperwork, he said. Planning, sorting the business, the house, making sure things go where they should. Oliver's shoulders stiffened. You mean a will, he said. Charles flinched. You're too young to worry about that, he said. Oliver gave a short, humorless laugh. I was 6 when Mom died, he said. Nobody asked if I was too young then. Silence followed. Esther saw the words hit Charles like thrown stones. He could have deflected. He could have snapped. Instead, for once, he let the hit land. You're right, Charles said quietly. You weren't too young to notice. He stared at the table, then spoke more softly. I have to make sure you're protected, he said, that the house doesn't become a battlefield when I'm gone. Esther felt her stomach knot, because she knew exactly which armies he meant, relatives with entitlement and lawyers with sharpened pens. Lucinda will expect to manage everything, Oliver said flatly. She's already planning where she'll sit, at the head of the table, when you're not here. Esther almost smiled at the accuracy. Charles exhaled slowly. Lucinda is my late wife's sister, he said. She cares about appearances. She cares about control, Oliver corrected. Charles didn't argue. He looked at Esther then, and the look carried something heavier than general gratitude. It carried specific memory. The greenhouse, The missing cash. The nights when Oliver only ate if she sat with him. The times Oliver only stayed in the house because she promised he wouldn't be left alone. "You've been more than your job," Charles said. Esther shook her head slightly. "I have done my job," she replied. "Properly. Care is not extra in a house with a child." Charles smiled faintly, without humor. "The contract never said you had to love him," he said. "You did that anyway." Oliver's face turned toward her automatically at the word love, searching for any sign she might deny it. She didn't. "And that makes things complicated," Charles continued. "Legally, socially, in the family." Oliver's shoulders tensed. "Why?" he asked. "Because she's not blood." Charles hesitated. "Because people like Lucinda see staff as temporary," he said. "They don't understand bonds that cross the lines they're used to." Oliver's jaw clenched. "So, you're going to let them win," he said. "You're going to pretend she doesn't matter so they don't get angry." Charles looked at his son, and for once he didn't look away. "No," he said. "I'm tired of pretending." He took a breath that seemed to cost him something. "I'm going to change my will," he said. "Properly this time, with thought, not just business instincts. I'm going to put in writing what this house already knows." Oliver's heart hammered. "What does it know?" he asked, voice quiet. Charles glanced at Esther. "That if I hadn't hired her," he said slowly, "I would have lost you a long time ago." The room went very still. Esther felt heat behind her eyes and forced it down, because this was not a moment to make anyone feel they had to comfort her. This was about Oliver hearing, at last, his father say something true. "And what does that mean for the paper?" Esther asked. "Practical. For the will." Charles looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen before. Respect, tinged with nervousness. "It means I'm naming you," he said, "as executor, as decision maker, if anything happens to me before Oliver is ready, as someone whose voice they'll have to listen to, even if they don't want to." Oliver stared. "You can do that," he said. "Yes," Charles replied. "I can." "What about the house?" Oliver asked, trying to sound casual and failing. Charles's mouth tightened. "This house isn't a trophy," he said. "It's a place you grew up in. It's also a place that hurt you. I don't want Lucinda treating it like a throne. I want it to stay safe, or to be used in a way that reflects what it became because of Esther, not because of me." He turned to Esther. "I want you to have it," he said quietly. "On paper, with conditions that tie it to Oliver's well-being. So if anyone wants to weaponize it, they have to go through you." Esther's pulse thudded in her ears. "Mr. Whitmore, that is not necessary," she began. "It is," Charles said firmly. "I know what my relatives are like. If I leave everything traditional, they will circle him like they circled me, expecting access, favors, influence. You've spent years standing between him and that noise. I'm asking you to keep doing it when I'm not here." Oliver felt the ground shift beneath him. Part of him wanted to shout with relief. Another part wanted to reject it, out of fear that accepting such a protection would tempt fate. "What if she doesn't want it?" he asked, sudden panic coloring his tone. "What if you're putting pressure on her?" Esther looked at him, then at Charles. "I don't need property," she said. "I need you safe." Charles nodded slowly. "This isn't a reward," he said. "It's a tool. I can't fix what I broke by not being present. I can build something that outlives me, which makes it harder for others to break you." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the future settling around them like another presence in the room. Oliver broke it with an awkward half-laugh. "Lucinda is going to explode," he said. Charles actually smiled, tired but real. "Let her," he replied. "She's been controlling this house from the foyer for too long." He stood a little slower than usual and placed a hand briefly on Oliver's shoulder. "You may not trust me fully," he said, "and I've earned that. But I need you to know this. I am not leaving you unprotected on purpose. Not again." He left the kitchen to make calls, to set appointments, to start the legal process that would one day read like a betrayal to some and like justice to others. When he was gone, Oliver looked at Esther. His eyes were glassy, but he wasn't crying. "Do you want it?" he asked. "The house, the responsibility, all of it." Esther thought of the nights she had spent sitting on that staircase while Oliver refused to sleep without knowing where she was. She thought of the arguments in the study, the whispering in corridors, the way staff had come and gone while she stayed rooted because of a boy who couldn't bear another disappearance. "I don't want the house," she said gently. "I want what the house can be. For you, for whoever comes after. If the paper helps with that, then yes, I will carry it." Oliver nodded, processing. "And if I mess up?" he said, voice small in a way he hadn't allowed it to be in years. "If I become like them, will you stop me?" Esther's answer was immediate. "Yes," she said, "even if you hate me for it." Oliver exhaled, a shaky sound that was almost a laugh. "Good," he said. "Then write it down." And that was how the decision at the heart of the will reading was born. Not from a sudden impulse, not from manipulation, but from a long, slow accumulation of days in which one woman showed up and one man finally admitted he hadn't. The paperwork took months, meetings with solicitors, discussions about trusts, arguments over phrasing. Charles did most of it quietly, not because he was ashamed, but because he wanted the ink dry before anyone had the chance to talk him out of it. He did tell one other person, though. Nadine, the family lawyer, looked up from the draft documents with raised eyebrows. "You understand this is unconventional," she said, leaving the house and primary control to a non-relative. Charles didn't flinch. "Esther is family," he said. "She just doesn't share my surname." Nadine studied him, then nodded slowly. "Unconventional isn't illegal," she said. "We'll make it watertight." Years later, when she read that same will out loud in a room full of shocked faces, she remembered this conversation. She remembered the certainty in Charles's voice. And she remembered thinking that the rarest thing in that house had never been money. It had been honesty. Charles Whitmore's decline did not happen suddenly. It happened in increments that the house learned to accommodate, the way a tree bends around a stone in soil without ever admitting the obstruction. One day he climbed the stairs without pause. The next, he rested halfway. One day he ate at the table with Oliver and Esther. The next, he took trays in his study because sitting upright felt like work. Esther adapted without complaint. She arranged the armchair in his office so light fell across the page when he signed papers. She left water by his bedside and ginger tea when mornings turned sour. She spoke to doctors on days when Charles's voice grew too thin to argue. Oliver watched her do it all with a quiet intensity, learning by example what caregiving looked like when pride didn't interfere. Lucinda noticed the change too and adjusted her approach. She stopped coming by the house unannounced. Instead, she sent careful emails, texts that sounded concerned but landed like reminders of obligation. "Checking in on Charles, let me know if you need anything." She called Oliver directly now, asking about school, about friends, about his plans after graduation, as if she were filling a gap no one else saw. Oliver answered politely but briefly. "I'm fine," he'd say. Esther's handling things here. He never mentioned her by name at first, testing Lucinda's reaction. When her voice sharpened, Esther's lovely, but she's not family, he'd end the call. Charles saw through it immediately. One afternoon, propped against pillows with oxygen tubes discreet under his nose, he called Oliver to his bedside. The boy sat carefully, as if the mattress might break. "She's circling," Charles said, voice gravelly but clear. "Lucinda, she thinks I'm weak now." Oliver's fingers tightened on the chair arm. "She thinks she'll change the will," he said. Charles gave a short laugh that turned into a cough. Esther appeared silently with water, holding the glass steady until he drank. Charles nodded thanks without looking away from his son. "She's right to worry," Charles said when he caught his breath. "I won't change it, but she'll try anyway." Oliver leaned forward. "What do we do?" Charles glanced at Esther, who had retreated to the doorway but stayed within earshot. "We do nothing," he said. "You live your life. Let her show herself. People who scheme always leave evidence." Oliver frowned. "And if she convinces people, you were manipulated." Charles's eyes hardened, the businessman surfacing through illness. "She'd have to prove Esther wanted something," he said. "Esther's never asked for anything. Not a raise, not a day off, not even a thank you." Esther shifted slightly in the doorway, uncomfortable with the praise, but unwilling to interrupt. Charles continued, "That's why it's her in the will. Not because I owe her, because she's the only one I trust to protect you from people who think love is a transaction." Oliver swallowed. "Even from you." Charles paused, then nodded. "Especially from me," he admitted. "I've made mistakes. She hasn't." The conversation stayed private, but its weight lingered. Oliver started carrying a small notebook, jotting dates and times of Lucinda's calls, phrases she repeated, questions she asked. He showed it to Esther one evening while she ironed shirts in the laundry room. "She keeps bringing up Mum's jewelry," he said, "asking if it's safe, like she thinks someone's going to sell it." Esther pressed the iron smoothly. "People who want control talk about loss," she said. "It makes them sound protective." Oliver watched her hands move. "Do you think she knows about the will?" Esther lifted the shirt, checked for creases, hung it carefully. "She suspects," she said. "Suspicion is enough for her." Charles's condition worsened through autumn. Hospital visits became weekly. Home nurses arrived with schedules Esther coordinated, without fuss. Oliver finished school with grades that surprised his teachers, not because he wasn't capable, but because he'd hidden his effort well. Lucinda timed her major move for mid-November, when Charles lay too weak to argue. She arrived with a notary and a folder of estate planning documents, claiming Charles had asked her to help update things while he rested. Esther met her at the door. "He's sleeping," Esther said. Lucinda smiled that familiar, tight smile. "I'll wait," she replied. "Family matters." Oliver appeared behind Esther, arms crossed. "Dad didn't mention this," he said. Lucinda's eyes flicked to him. "He's tired, darling," she said. "I'm helping." Oliver didn't move. "Esther handles his papers," he said. Lucinda's smile thinned. "Esther is staff," she replied. "I'm blood." Esther stepped aside slightly, letting Oliver lead. He gestured toward the sitting room. "Wait there," he said. "I'll check on him." Lucinda sat, tapping her folder, while Oliver climbed the stairs. Charles was awake, but groggy, propped on pillows with a tray untouched beside him. "Aunt Lucinda's here," Oliver said quietly, "with a notary. Wants to change things." Charles's eyes sharpened despite fatigue. "Tell her no," he said. Oliver hesitated. "She'll say you're not yourself." Charles gripped his son's arm weakly. "Get Nadine," he said. "The lawyer. Now." Oliver nodded and left. Minutes later, Nadine arrived, brisk and professional, her heels clicking authority into the foyer. Lucinda stood when she entered, surprised. "Nadine," Lucinda said warmly. "Perfect timing." Nadine didn't smile back. "Charles called me," she said. "He's clear on what he wants." Lucinda's composure slipped. "I'm just helping with some updates," she said, holding up her folder. Nadine glanced inside without touching it. "Those aren't his documents," she said. "You printed your own." Lucinda flushed. "To save time." "Time for what?" Nadine interrupted. "To get signatures while he's medicated." Charles's voice called weakly from upstairs. "Lucinda." Everyone turned. He stood at the top of the landing, leaning on the banister, pale but upright. "Come up," he said. Lucinda climbed the stairs carefully, as if each step measured her remaining influence. In Charles's room, she sat beside the bed and opened her folder. "I've brought some sensible changes," she began. "Oliver's future, the house, Vivian's jewelry." Charles looked at her steadily. "No." Lucinda blinked. "Charles." "No," he repeated. "Everything stays as it is. Esther, the trusts, all of it." Lucinda leaned closer. "You're not thinking clearly," she said softly. "Let me protect the family." Charles's voice gained strength. "You've spent years trying to control it," he said. "You don't protect, you manage." Lucinda's hands tightened on the folder. "After everything," she said, "Vivian was my sister." "And Esther raised my son," Charles replied. "You visited." Lucinda stood abruptly. "People will talk," she warned, giving everything to the housemaid. "Let them," Charles said. "My conscience is clear." Nadine appeared in the doorway. "I'll witness if you want to reconfirm," she said. Charles nodded. "Do it," he said. "Today." Lucinda left without another word, her heels echoing down the stairs like retreating gunfire. Oliver watched her go from the hallway, notebook in hand. "She'll fight it," he said to Esther later that evening. Esther folded laundry methodically. "She might," she agreed, "but paper doesn't care about anger." Charles stabilized briefly after that, long enough to spend Christmas at home. He sat by the tree with Oliver, asking questions he'd never asked before. Favorite books, friends' names, what university felt right. Oliver answered cautiously at first, then more openly, surprised by his father's attention. Esther watched from the kitchen doorway, ironing a tablecloth, feeling the fragile peace settle. Charles caught her eye and mouthed, "Thank you," across the room. She nodded once, because thanks between them had become a language of glances. Winter deepened. Charles weakened again. In February, he took to bed permanently. Nurses came daily. Oxygen hummed constantly. Oliver skipped his final school term to stay close. Lucinda sent flowers and cards that went unanswered. She called twice, left voicemails Oliver deleted. In March, Charles called her one last time. "I'm naming Esther," he said into the phone, voice faint but firm. "Don't contest it, for Vivian's sake." Lucinda's reply crackled through the speaker. "You're delirious," she snapped. "I'm lucid," Charles corrected, "and tired of your games. Goodbye, Lucinda." He hung up. Oliver stood by the bed, fists clenched. "She won't stop," he said. Charles reached for his hand. "She might not," he agreed, "but you will. Be steady. Let truth do the work." 2 days later, Charles died peacefully in the night. Esther found him at dawn, his face calm, one hand resting on the will beside him, like final proof. The funeral was small. Oliver spoke briefly, voice cracking only once. Lucinda attended in black, flanked by cousins, and a lawyer whose face Oliver memorized. Esther stood at the back during the graveside service, head covered respectfully. Lucinda didn't approach her. Not yet. The will reading came a week later. Esther dressed simply, knowing scrutiny waited. Oliver met her at the door. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. "As I'll ever be." They drove together, rain light but steady. Inside the solicitor's office, Lucinda sat front and center, composed, expectant. Cousins murmured beside her. Matthew avoided eyes. Esther took the chair Oliver indicated, hands folded, breathing even. The solicitor began. When her name came property, accounts, guardianship, the room inhaled collectively. Lucinda's face went rigid, Matthew whispered furiously. A cousin gasped audibly. Oliver didn't move. Esther felt eyes on her but kept her gaze forward. Charles had chosen her not for drama, but for dependability. Lucinda stood halfway through. "This can't be right," she said, voice carrying. The solicitor didn't pause. "It's right," he said. "Signed, witnessed, notarized." Lucinda turned to Oliver. "You'll contest this," she said urgently. Oliver met her eyes. "No," he replied. "Dad knew what he wanted." Lucinda's composure shattered. "You're throwing away your legacy," she hissed. Oliver stood. "She is my legacy," he said. He offered Esther his arm. She took it. They walked out into the clearing rain, leaving silence behind. Outside, Oliver exhaled. "They'll try something," he said. Esther nodded. "Let them," she replied. "We have the truth." Lucinda Hale did not accept defeat quietly. She never had. Within 3 weeks of the will reading, her legal team filed a contest in probate court, claiming Charles Whitmore lacked capacity at the time of signing and had been unduly influenced by Esther Adeyemi. The documents arrived at Whitmore House by courier, thick envelopes sealed with the kind of finality that promised expense and exhaustion. Oliver read the first page aloud in the kitchen, voice flat but eyes burning. "Undue influence," he said. "They say you manipulated him when he was vulnerable. They say you isolated him from family." Esther set down her tea without a ripple. "Isolated," she repeated. "The same family who visited twice a year." Oliver folded the papers carefully. "They want everything," he said. "The house, the accounts, guardianship of me, even though I'm an adult. They claim I'm not competent to manage my own inheritance." Esther's jaw tightened. "Competent," she said. "The word doctors use for patients who follow instructions. The word lawyers use for clients who pay bills." Oliver looked at her across the table, the boy who had once clutched her hand in fear, now carrying the weight of decisions. "Do we fight?" he asked. Esther held his gaze. "We don't choose," she replied. "They chose. We answer." Nadine, their solicitor, arrived that afternoon with boxes of documents and a whiteboard. She spread papers across the dining table like a battlefield map: medical records, witness statements, financial logs, Charles's personal correspondence. "Capacity is the key," Nadine said. "Lucinda needs to prove Charles wasn't himself. We prove he was more himself than ever." Oliver traced a finger down the contest filing. "They'll drag your name through everything," he warned Esther. "Your background, your finances. They'll say you stayed for money." Esther nodded once. "Let them look," she said. "I have receipts for every grocery bag I bought." Nadine smiled faintly. "That's why we win these," she said. Truth doesn't hide. The first hearing came quickly, a preliminary session to decide if the contest had merit. Lucinda's lawyer, a polished man named Hargrove, stood in court, smelling of expensive aftershave and overconfidence. He painted Charles as frail, medicated, prey to a caregiver who had ingratiated herself over years. Mr. Whitmore was isolated, Hargrove declared. His sister-in-law, Miss Hale, was barred from meaningful contact. The defendant, Miss Adeyemi, controlled access to both the father and son. Oliver sat rigid beside Esther, fists clenched under the table. Nadine rose smoothly. Miss Hale visited monthly, she countered. Phone records show. Emails show. She was never barred. Mr. Whitmore chose his priorities. Hargrove smiled thinly. Priorities shaped by undue influence. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and graying hair, glanced at medical timelines. "We'll need full records," she said. "Both sides." Lucinda watched from the gallery, chin high, as if watching her strategy unfold. Esther met her gaze once, expression neutral. Lucinda looked away first. Depositions began the following week. Staff spoke first. The cleaner admitted Lucinda often asked leading questions about Esther's hours. She'd say things like, "Esther seems very comfortable here, doesn't she?" the woman said. "Always fishing." The security guard testified about the planted cash footage. Mr. Hale was the only outsider with study access that week, he said. Miss Adeyemi never went near the desk. Lucinda's team pressed witnesses hard. "Did Miss Adeyemi ever discuss money with Mr. Whitmore?" Hargrove asked the cook. The cook shook her head. "Never," she replied. "She'd turn down overtime sometimes to be with Oliver when he was upset." Hargrove's jaw ticked. "And Mr. Whitmore's mental state?" The cook hesitated. "Clear as anyone," she said, "until the end." Charles's doctors testified next. He understood his condition, the cardiologist said. He asked informed questions, signed consent forms without hesitation. "Any signs of coercion?" Hargrove pushed. The doctor frowned. "None," he said. Miss Adeyemi was present at appointments, but deferred to Mr. Whitmore's decisions. Lucinda took the stand herself, voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "Charles changed after Vivian died," she said, dabbing her eyes. "Esther filled a void. He grew dependent." Nadine cross-examined gently but relentlessly. "You visited monthly," she said. "Did you ever discuss the will with Charles?" Lucinda hesitated. "Not directly." Nadine slid documents forward. "These emails show you asking about estate planning 6 times in 2 years, she said. "Were you concerned about influence then?" Lucinda flushed. "Family concern." Nadine nodded. "And this text to your son, 3 days before the final signing. We need to move faster. Concern or strategy?" Lucinda's lawyer objected. The judge overruled. The turning point came during discovery. Nadine's team uncovered Vivian's letters, private notes Charles had kept locked in his desk drawer, written during her pregnancy and Oliver's early years. Lucinda's team demanded them as evidence of family dynamics. Esther read them first in Nadine's office, hands steady. Vivian had written about exhaustion, about Charles's long hours, about her growing reliance on Esther even then. "She's the steady one," one letter said. "Oliver lights up when she enters a room. Charles notices too, even if he won't say it." Another, dated months before the accident. "If something happens to me, promise you'll keep her close. She's family now." Oliver read them in silence, tears falling on the pages. "Mum knew," he whispered. Nadine placed a hand on his shoulder. "This proves Charles's choices started with Vivian," she said, "not manipulation." Lucinda's team fought to suppress the letters. "Privileged," Hargrove argued. "Relevant," Nadine countered. "They show intent." The judge admitted them. Trial day arrived under gray skies. Courtroom benches filled with distant relatives, reporters from local business pages, curious neighbors. Lucinda sat front row, composed, Matthew beside her. Esther wore the same navy dress from the will reading. Oliver sat straight-backed, notebook in lap. Hargrove opened dramatically. A grieving widower, a loyal employee who crossed boundaries, a will that defies family tradition. Nadine opened simply. A father who recognized, who raised his son. Documents don't lie. People do. Witnesses repeated depositions. Charles's final doctor testified last. He was alert, the doctor said, knew the implications, signed willingly. Hargrove's closing hammered vulnerability. A man on oxygen, dependent on one caregiver. Obvious influence. Nadine's closing cut deeper. Mr. Whitmore planned this for years. Letters prove it. Witnesses prove it. Ms. Hale's actions planted cash. Whispered doubts prove her motive. She turned to the judge. The evidence shows choice, not coercion. Lucinda testified in rebuttal, voice breaking artfully. Charles wasn't himself, she said. Esther became indispensable. He confused gratitude with duty. Nadine cross-examined. You tried to fire her first, she said, showing the audit timeline. When that failed, you contested, which shows more influence. Lucinda stammered. Protecting family. Nadine held up Vivian's letter. Vivian called her family, she said. The judge recessed. Days passed. Oliver paced the house. Esther cooked methodically, grounding them both. Ruling day. Lucinda arrived early, expectant. Esther and Oliver entered last. The judge spoke clearly. I find Mr. Whitmore had capacity, she said. No evidence of undue influence. Ms. Hale's contest fails. Costs to petitioner. Lucinda stood, face ashen. Matthew pulled her arm. Reporters scribbled. Oliver exhaled. Esther touched his wrist once, brief. Outside, Lucinda cornered them on the steps. This isn't over, she hissed. People will know what you've done. Oliver met her eyes. Everyone knows what you did, he replied. Court said it. Lucinda walked away, heels clicking defeat. Esther and Oliver drove home in silence. Rain cleared to sun. Oliver spoke first. What now? Esther glanced at him. Now we live, she said. Truth won. He nodded, shoulders easing for the first time in months. But as they pulled into the driveway, a courier waited with new papers. Lucinda's final play. A civil suit claiming emotional distress. Esther sighed. She doesn't quit. Oliver smiled faintly. Neither do we. Section 9, Lucinda's last stand. The civil suit arrived like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave, even after coffee went cold. Lucinda Hale filed it 3 days after the probate ruling, claiming intentional infliction of emotional distress against Esther Adeyemi. The papers alleged Esther had knowingly participated in a scheme to defraud the family and caused irreparable harm to familial bonds. She demanded compensation for pain and suffering, access to Whitmore House, and a public apology. Oliver read the complaint aloud in the sitting room, voice rising with each paragraph until it broke into incredulous laughter. Pain and suffering, he repeated. From losing a house she never lived in. Esther sat across from him, hands folded, expression calm but eyes sharp. She needs money, Esther said, and she needs to punish someone. You cannot give her the first, so she takes the second. Nadine arrived within the hour, briefcase in hand, already pulling case law on her tablet, frivolous. She declared, scanning the filing. She's banking on settlement pressure. Most people pay to avoid court. Oliver's jaw set. We're not paying. Nadine nodded approval. Good. Discovery will bury her. We'll demand every communication, financial record, visitor log from the last decade. Esther spoke quietly. She will use Oliver's childhood, she said. Therapy notes, school reports. She will say I damaged him. Nadine met her gaze. Did you? Esther shook her head once. No. Then we win, Nadine replied. Discovery began immediately. Lucinda's lawyers requested Oliver's medical history, Esther's employment records, even Vivian's accident report. Nadine countered with a broader net. Lucinda's bank statements, phone records, emails to financial advisors, property searches in her name. The first bombshell arrived 2 weeks later. Lucinda's personal accounts showed regular transfers to an offshore trust, modest at first, then larger after Vivian's death. The trust owned property in Spain, a boat slip in Monaco, accounts that didn't match her declared income as a consultant. Oliver stared at the statements Nadine spread across the table. She was stealing from Dad, he said, voice hollow. All those years she complained about money, she was moving it offshore. Nadine tapped a highlighted line. Started 6 months before Vivian died, she said. Vivian confronted her about it. There's an email chain. Oliver's hands shook. Show me. Vivian had written, Lucy, the Spain account is in your name, but funded from Charles's household line. Explain this, or I tell him. Lucinda replied, family business. Don't make trouble. Charles never saw the emails. Vivian died 3 weeks later. Esther read silently, then closed the folder. She killed her own sister for money, Esther said softly. Nadine shook her head. Not killed, but she benefited from silence. Oliver stood abruptly. I want her charged. Nadine placed a hand on his arm. Criminal case is separate, she said. Civil suit first. This destroys her credibility. Lucinda's deposition came next. Under oath, video recorded, she sat in a conference room wearing pearls and a silk blouse, posture perfect. Nadine began gently. You visited Whitmore House monthly, Nadine said. Records confirm. Yes, Lucinda replied. Family duty. Nadine slid forward bank statements. These show transfers totaling £240,000 to an offshore trust, she said. Vivian emailed you about it shortly before her death. And statements. Lucinda's composure flickered. Personal matters, she said. Nadine pressed. Vivian demanded explanation. You ignored her. Charles never knew. Lucinda lifted her chin. Vivian overreacted. Nadine opened a file. This police report from 2001 shows you wrote a bad check to a jeweler, she said. Charges dropped after Vivian intervened. Lucinda flushed. Ancient history. Nadine continued methodically. 2012. You borrowed £50,000 from Charles. Repayable, quote, when convenient. Never repaid. Family loans? Lucinda snapped. Pattern, Nadine replied. Vivian confronted you repeatedly. After her death, transfers increased. Lucinda's lawyer objected. The videographer noted it. Nadine moved on. You planted cash to frame Esther, Nadine said. Security footage confirms Matthew took it. Lucinda's eyes darted. Misunderstanding. Nadine showed Vivian's final email. Lucy, stop using Charles, for Oliver's sake. Lucinda snapped. Vivian was weak, she said. Always siding with servants. Silence followed. Her lawyer blanched. The camera captured it all. Esther's deposition came a week later. Lucinda's team grilled her for hours. Wages, hours, access to safes, conversations with Charles. Esther answered evenly, never raising her voice. Did you ever discuss inheritance? Hargrove asked. No, Esther said. Never. No. Hargrove leaned forward. You raised Oliver like a son. No boundaries. Esther met his eyes. I raised him like a child who needed care. Boundaries were for adults who failed him. Hargrove pushed. You profited. Esther listed her salary, taxes paid, savings modest. I stayed for him, she said, not for profit. Oliver testified last. At 24, he spoke with adult clarity, but carried the weight of a boy who'd learned early to read rooms. Lucinda's lawyer tried condescension. You resented your father, Hargrove suggested. Esther filled that gap. Oliver leaned forward. Esther taught me to forgive him, he said. You wouldn't understand, Hargrove pressed. She manipulated you. Oliver smiled faintly. She taught me to question manipulation, he replied. Like when aunts take money and blame others. The judge dismissed the suit a month later. Frivolous and retaliatory, she wrote. Costs to defendant. Sanctions against petitioner. Costs. Lucinda appealed. Lost again. Reporters covered the offshore accounts. Her Spain property sold at loss. Social invitations dried up. But the deepest cut came from Vivian's journal, discovered in attic boxes during house inventory. Oliver found it first, hidden in a hat box with faded ribbons. Vivian had written daily during Oliver's early years, then sporadically after. Esther read selected entries aloud one rainy afternoon. Esther sees him, Vivian wrote, when Oliver was 4. Charles provides. Esther nurtures. Later, Lucy asked for money again. Charles doesn't see the pattern. I do. Final entry. Week before the accident. If I'm gone, Esther keeps him safe. Charles will fight it. Oliver will need her anyway. Promise me. Journal. Promise. Oliver closed the book, tears falling freely now. She knew, he whispered. Esther touched his shoulder. She chose you, she said, and me. The choice came months later, after dust settled. Whitmore House stood empty of relatives. Lucinda faded to occasional postcards. Oliver ignored. Oliver sat Esther down one evening. The house is yours, he said. Conditions met. Dad's trusts secure. What now? Esther looked around the kitchen where she'd spent 18 years. Sell it, she said. Give proceeds to children's homes. Ones like what I needed once. Oliver blinked. You don't want it. I want you free, she replied. House carries memories. Some good, some heavy. Let it become something else. Oliver nodded slowly. And us? Esther smiled. Us stays, she said. Not here, somewhere new. They sold the house to a trust for foster youth, stipulating scholarships in Vivian's name. Proceeds funded 3 homes, therapy programs, emergency funds. Esther bought a small flat near Oliver's university. He visited Sundays, bringing groceries he pretended to just have extra. They cooked together, argued over politics, laughed at old stories. Lucinda sent one last letter. You've destroyed a family, it read. Esther framed it in her new hallway. No, she told Oliver, pointing. We built one. Years passed. Oliver graduated, worked in social policy, and advocated for caregiver protections. Esther volunteered at the homes funded by the sale, teaching mothers how to advocate without apology. At 32, Oliver called one evening. I'm getting married, he said. Sarah, you met her. Esther smiled into the phone. I remember. Will you stand with me? He asked. Not as a staff, as a family. Esther's voice caught. Always, she said. At the wedding, no relatives attended from Lucinda's side. Oliver didn't notice. He danced with Esther during the father-daughter song, her hand light on his shoulder. You kept your promise, he said softly. Esther squeezed his hand. You kept yours, she replied. And in that moment, the will reading that had once silenced a room became the quiet foundation of a life rebuilt not on money, but on presence. Conclusion. Summary. Esther Adeyemi never wanted to be a headline, but the will reading forced a wealthy family to admit what they spent years denying. Oliver Whitmore was raised, steadied, and protected by the woman they kept calling staff, while the people with the right surname mostly showed up when money was involved. When Charles died, Lucinda tried to seize control by attacking Esther's character and rewriting Oliver's childhood into a story of undue influence. But witnesses, records, and Vivian's private letters exposed the truth. Esther's loyalty wasn't a strategy. It was a lifelong act of care, and Charles's decision had been deliberate for years. The courtroom fight didn't end with one ruling, because Lucinda's real need wasn't justice, it was dominance. So she escalated into a retaliatory civil suit that collapsed under scrutiny when her own financial secrets surfaced. Meanwhile, Oliver finally received something he'd been missing since childhood: public validation that his bond with Esther was real, legitimate, and worth defending. With Lucinda's power broken, the house stopped being a symbol of status and became a tool for healing. Oliver and Esther chose to sell Whitmore House and redirect its value into protecting other young people, funding support that would prevent children from being stranded, silenced, or used as leverage. In the final image of the story, the will reading that once left a room speechless becomes something quieter and stronger, a family rebuilt on presence instead of bloodlines. Oliver grows into the kind of man who doesn't confuse love with ownership, and Esther finally lives without having to prove she deserves to belong. The twist was never the maid got the house. The twist was that the richest inheritance wasn't property. It was the truth about who actually raised him. If you're using this as your video's final minute, here are 2 comment-driven closing lines you can choose from. Who do you think deserved to be named in that will blood relatives, or the person who stayed every day? If you were Oliver, would you have fought the family or walked away and protected Esther from the drama?